here, are equally strong. Okay, let's get started on this one. So first of all, what's the question asking?
Call two arms equally strong if the heaviest weights they each are able to lift are equal. Call two people equally strong if their strongest arms are equally strong. The strongest arm can be both the right and the left, and so are their weakest arms. Given your and your friend's arms lifting capabilities, find out if you two are equally strong.
Okay, so kind of a strange question. I mean, basically we've got a whole bunch of arguments here. They represent our arm strength. I don't know what the units are that we're measuring the arm strength in. Maybe it's in here. Oh, okay, so it's the heaviest weight. So maybe it's kilograms, maybe it's pounds. I don't know if it's specified here, but anyway, doesn't matter. That's the heaviest weight that that particular arm can lift, and I think it's pretty much the same thing for all four of these. You know, your left arm, your right arm, your friend's left, your friend's right. Okay, so what are we really checking here? We're checking to see if we are equally strong to our friend. And what that means is that basically our strongest arm, whether it's the left or the right, is just as strong as their strongest arm, and our not as strongest arm is just as strong as their not as strongest arm. Okay, so basically the idea here is that what we're trying to check is basically, is your left the same as friend's left, and your right the same as friend's right. So that's one possibility, but it could also be kind of flipped. So it could be, or your left is the same as the friend's right, and your right is the same as your friend's left. Okay, so that's basically what we're trying to check. We can run the tests on that, and it's going to pass them all. Or at least it's passing all the visible ones. Is it going to pass all of them? Let's try submitting that real quick and see if it passes all of them. And yeah, it turns out it does. So that could be a record, actually. That was pretty fast. It did not take us very long to get through that one. So that's, you know, kind of a simple task, not that interesting. But like I was saying before, maybe we can make it interesting. So first of all, I'm just going to sort of space this out a little bit. Actually, I don't think that looks any nicer. I think that actually looks a little worse. Maybe like that. I'm not sure. Anyway, the point is, this is basically what we're trying to check, and we found that this passed all the tests, no problem. Okay, so what are some other ways that we could do this? Well, we could maybe like, okay, we could do something like this. So we could say something like, let your strongest be assigned the value of math.max, your left, your right. Okay, so that's going to give us what your strongest is. And then your, I don't want to say weakest, so let's just say your second strongest is going to be math.min of your left and your right. Okay, and then we'll say let friend's strongest be assigned the value of math.max. And we're basically just going to do the same thing for our friend here. We're going to find what's their maximum strength arm and what's their second maximum strength arm using these math functions. And then what that's going to provide is an easy way for us to compare them at the end. So we can just say return your strongest is the same as friend's strongest, and your second strongest is the same as your friend's second strongest. I mean, that's really what we're trying to check after all. We'll get the semicolon at the end there, and there we go, nice and easy. The problem is that it's maybe not that easy if we have to go through all of these each time. So basically, as we talked about before, we want to be dry when we're doing programming. We want to not repeat ourselves. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. It's a really important rule to sort of remember. So I would say even though all four of these lines are kind of unique in their own ways, they're similar enough that maybe there's a way we can organize this in such a way that that's going to make it easier to compare. So we found that one way to do that when we're trying to avoid repetition, when we're trying to think of an efficient way to handle something that we're kind of doing repetitively, one way to deal with that is functions. We can make a new function. I don't know, something like, for example, over here we could do a function to get your strongest arm. So something like function strongest, and we're given left and right, and basically it's going to return math.max left, right. Okay, and then we could also say something like function second strongest out of left and right, which will just return very similarly math.min of that left and right. And we got to make sure that we abide by the case sensitivity of our math library. So don't want a capital A in there. Okay, so then instead of this, we could do something like your strongest is strongest of your left and your right. So doing it like that versus the way we were doing it before, not much of a difference here. Where it becomes maybe a little more powerful or a little more better is if we just do it like this. So we don't need to worry about using those new variable names if we can just sort of yeah, what did I want to do? Your second strongest, this one over here. So basically, I can just call these functions now, and maybe that's better. I don't know. It's still not looking super great. Strongest from friends left, friends right, and then we'll do the same thing over here. Second strongest of friends left and friends right. Okay, so just delete this intermediary stuff over here, and we'll see if we get the same thing. Okay, so that's pretty good, but still doesn't look all that nice. I mean, this is a big pile of garbage, and then we have this other stuff up here that we're defining. So maybe there's still a more efficient way that we can do this. And yeah, it turns out there is. So if we don't want to use a function, maybe another way we can sort of avoid repeating ourselves too much is by using an object. Okay, so we haven't really gotten that into objects yet. I mean, what we've basically seen is something like this. We'd say let arms be assigned the value of this object thing, right? And so then we could say like, I don't know, strongest is going to be math.max of, let's say, your left and your right. And what else? Second strongest is math.min of your left and your right. And okay, we could go with that. And let's just say arms dot strongest. Okay, we're just going to return arms dot strongest. And maybe, oh, what do we have here? It doesn't like this. Invalid shorthand property initializer. Oh yeah. Okay, so this is a good moment for us to encounter here. Basically, I use an equals. What I should have done is a colon, just like the other one over here. This is an object. It's a JavaScript object, and we'll write it in JavaScript object notation, also known as JSON. Okay, so let's see if that works. Now that I have strongest and second strongest kind of declared the way they should be. So 15, that's arms.strongest, and you'll notice that was the your right in this case, but it could have been your left depending on the situation. So here it was your left. Okay, great. And maybe a better way to put this instead of just arms would be to say your arms, right? Because that's what we're talking about in this case. We're not talking about your friend right now. We're talking about your arms. Okay, so that's an object, and maybe even we could put in another property for this object. So when we say property, we're talking about things like this. And well, actually, before we move on, before we add this flex property, let's say I sort of want to talk about the difference between this and an array, right? Because for an array, we could have two elements just like this, and we could say this is the 0th element, this is the first element. So we can sort of think of an object, a JSON, as being like an array, except instead of doing this kind of thing like your arms at 0, instead we have names for the indices. So the indices aren't just going to be 0 and 1. They're going to be called things like strongest and second strongest. So this is still trying to run a test of, what did I have in there? Did I try running it when I had the 0 in there? Yeah, okay, there we go. So I have a null. Now I've got strongest as my index, so to speak, for this thing. So it should basically be returning the value that it gets from this. And I think in the first test, it's going to be 15. And we'll just wait for that to resolve. There we go. So we get 15 out of that. Okay, so those are basically two ways we can do it. We can say your arms at the index of the word strongest, or the string strongest, or we could just do dot strongest. Strongest, did I spell that right? Yeah, okay, great. And that should work exactly the same way. We're going to get 15 back in either case. Great. So now let's say we want to add another property, and this one's called flex. Except this one is going to be maybe more like a function. Okay, so it's a function that we can call, and it's just going to do console log flexing. Okay, for now, let's say that's what it's going to do. Oh, okay, I'm getting a page refresh here. I'm not sure what that's all about. Oh, okay. Maybe they ran an update or something like that. Not sure. But anyway, where were we? So we were putting in a function here, and it was one that's just going to do a quick console log, and there, the word flex for now. Okay, so your arms dot flex. Now the thing is, if I try doing this, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to give us what we want, because flex is a function now. And yes, we can sort of pass around functions if we want to, but really what we're trying to do is call this function. We actually want it to do the console log. So let's run this instead, and now we're not returning the function, we're running the function. So it's returning nothing, but it's saying flex. Okay, great. So then maybe we want to say something that's a little more accurate, a little more representative. This will say, hey, my strongest is, and then we'll concatenate in this dot strongest. Yeah. Okay. Let's try that. So when I say this dot strongest, what am I talking about? Well, basically I'm talking about strongest, but specifically whatever the value of strongest is for this particular object. And that might seem strange right now. You know, it might seem like, well, why don't you just do strongest instead of this dot strongest? And there is a reason for that. And maybe we'll look at that reason. Yeah, now. Let's look at that reason now. Okay, so basically what we want to do is we want to make this object more general. Because basically right now we're just saying your arms is just this object right here. It's an object containing the properties strongest and second strongest, and we're assigning them some values over here. And then it also contains a property which is a function. So normally when we have a function that's a property of an object, we call that a method. So this is a method for the your arms object, and it's the flex method. The thing is, yeah, this isn't really going to be any like I could just say instead of this dot strong, I could do math.max or something like that. Like it's going to be the same no matter what. It's just your arms we're talking about. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say function arms. Okay, so this is a new function. It's called arms. It's going to take in left, just left and right. And basically the idea is that from here we're going to construct a new object. So it's not just going to be for your arms. We could have your arms, friend's arms, someone else's arms. So this is just arms in general. We're just sort of saying in general, if you want to make a new object and it's an arms type of object, well, what is it going to have in it? It's going to have this dot strongest, okay, which is going to be assigned the value of this right here. Well, actually not quite that, because it's going to be math.max, left, right. Okay, there we go. And this dot second strongest is going to be assigned the value of math.min of left and right. Okay, so before we go any further, you might be wondering, well, what's left and right? Left and right is whatever we call it with. So we've already got your arms over here, but let's say friend's arms is going to be new arms. Okay, so we're using the new keyword to say that we're trying to instantiate an instance of this object here. So I know you might be thinking, well, isn't that a function? Yeah, that's true. The syntax here is a little strange, and we'll get into some other syntax a little later, but the main thing is that this is basically kind of like a constructor. It's like our prototype of what an arm is, right? So we'll do new arms, and what arguments are we going to use? Well, we're going to use friends left and friends right. There we go. Okay, so then let's do this instead. So we're going to return friends arms dot strongest. And let's see if that works the same way that that it did up here. Well, we're getting a 15. So that's good, right? I mean, that was our friend's strongest in this case. Let's see what we're getting in other ones. Should be 10 over there. Good. Should be 20 over there. So it looks like it's just giving us the strongest out of the two. Did I already click on that one? Okay, it looks like it's the right arm. Okay, there we go. So there's a lefty. Okay, great. So basically the idea here is that this is a way that we can just sort of create a new object in general, and we could even say something like this dot flex is assign the value of function, and it'll do what it was doing before. So it's going to do a console log, and it'll say, hey, my strongest is, and then we're going to put in this dot strongest, whatever it happens to be, and then we'll put period, bicep emoji. You know, just to really show that this is a flex that's happening here. Okay, and then okay, let's just do, we'll do your arms dot flex, and we'll do friends arms dot flex, and then we'll return friends arms dot strongest. There we go. Okay, so we're getting the 15, which is the friend's arms dot strongest, but then we're also getting these two things. Hey, my strongest is 15. Hey, my strongest is 15. Bicep emoji. So the difference there is this one had bicep emoji, this one did not. But I think at this point we're probably ready to make these consistent. So we don't need to be repeating ourselves like this. We could just say new arms, your left, and your right. There we go. Okay, so basically now we have two objects here. Your arms is an object, friend's arms is an object, and those represent your arms and your friend's arms. I mean, it's sort of self-explanatory in terms of the variable names, I would say. Okay, great. So now we're both getting this bicep emoji. They both happen to have the same strongest, same there. Okay, so now this is a situation where their strongest is different. Okay, great. So what else is there to talk about here? Well, one thing we could do is, let's say we forgot to put in the flex function, or maybe let's say we didn't want to put in the flex function because every time we're doing this this instantiation, every time we're creating a new one of these arms objects, it's declaring this, and basically we're redefining the function every time. So let's say we don't want to do that, and instead we'll cut this out. We can alter this afterwards. So we could say something like arms dot flex is going to be assigned the value of, here we go, function, all that kind of stuff, right? So we're assigning this function to arms.flex. So we'll see how that goes. And oh, we have a problem here. Your arms.flex is not a function. That's frustrating because I thought, you know, arms.flex, I'm defining this thing. So here's where we're going to use an important keyword. We're going to use the .prototype keyword. So now we're basically saying it's not just one particular instance of arms that's getting the flex function, it's all of them. This is altering what it means to even be an arms object. Okay, so an arms object is now going to have, as part of its prototype, it's going to have this flex thing. So when we're using prototype, we're basically using that to kind of alter the constructor of our object. And a constructor is, well, it's basically that. It's like the prototype of what the object is supposed to look like. So there may be some particular things, like, you know, it could be, I could have said instead of strongest, make this 10 every time. And then no matter what, whatever object we instantiate is always going to have 10. My strongest is 10, my strongest is 10, my strongest is 10, my strongest is 10. But I want it to be a little more dynamic than that. I want it to take on the actual value of whichever one of these is stronger. Okay, but then basically now we're saying In addition to all that, you're going to have this flex function. And well, I guess just by running that last test, we already found this is working. It is actually equipping these things with this new function that doesn't do anything super interesting, but notably, because of the this keyword, it has access to strongest, whatever that strongest is. Okay, so that's kind of cool for, well, for a few reasons. I mean, this prototype thing is something that we can maybe use in other instances. Like, just to sort of clear this out for a sec, we've looked at some previous challenges that might have something like, let word be assigned the value of cat, let's say. And then we want to check if this thing is return. We want to return if this is a palindrome, right? So word dot is palindrome, let's say. That would be nice, right? If we had a function for that. The thing is, obviously, we don't have a function for that. It's not a built-in. So it's saying, well, that's not a function. What are you talking about? Okay, so then we could say, well, word is a string, right? So let's say string dot prototype dot is palindrome is assigned the value of a function, and it's basically just going to say return this dot split dot reverse dot join is equal to this. So it's just going to check, is it a palindrome? Would it be spelled the same way backwards and forwards? So now, hopefully it shouldn't tell me that is palindrome is not a function. Instead, it should just return false because this is not a palindrome. So there we go. We're getting false. We're getting false. This thing is not a palindrome. But we could make it a palindrome, taco cat. And so now this should give us true because, there we go, it is spelled the same left and right. We get the same thing when we reverse it. So that's pretty neat, right? We're able to actually alter what it means to be a string, what it means to be an instance of a string. Now, by doing this, we're saying every string is going to be equipped with this new method called isPalindrome that's going to make it very easy for us to just check if it's a palindrome. So that's pretty neat. We could also do stuff like, array.prototype.equals, let's say, and it's going to be a function that takes in another array. And basically the idea is that for let I be assigned the value 0, I is less than this dot length. And this, in this case, is talking about the array here. So we'll say if this at I is not equal to other array at I, then under that circumstance we want to return false. And if it makes it through the whole thing without that being an issue, we'll turn true. But just to be sure, let's say this dot length is the same as other array dot length, because it could be that there's more stuff in other array and we're just not getting to it in this loop. Okay, so that's basically to check if two arrays are equal, and that could be useful, because we could say something like let your arms be assigned the value of your left and your right, and then let friend's arms be assigned the value of friend's left and friend's right. And then from there we could say your arms dot sort according to this sorting function for numbers, which we've seen before, which is going to put them in order for us, and friend's arms dot sort pq whoops p minus q. There we go. And then we can just return your arms dot equals friend's arms, and we'll see if that works for us. Oh, it's having an issue with what we have down here. So I guess, and by the way, you probably noticed that's not something that I don't believe that's an issue for var, but because I'm using a let, I'm trying to reassign something with a let, and it's like, well, what are you talking about? You already declared that thing. Yeah, and sorry, I didn't mean reassign, I mean redeclare. Okay, there we go. So that is another way of passing all the tests here. So we've modified the array prototype. We're saying now arrays have this ability to check if they're equal, right? Because what we found before is we weren't able to do something like this. This didn't work because it was basically saying, well, let's compare to see if your arms and friends' arms are pointing to the same address. Are they pointing to the same array? And no, they're not pointing to the same array. The issue is that they are different arrays, but they contain the same elements, which is what makes them equal here. And keep in mind, this equals thing wouldn't work if we were to just delete this up here. Now it's going to say, what are you talking about? There's no equals function for arrays. So by switching up the prototype here, we're able to give it that new ability. In fact, we could go even further and we could say, well, you know what? I don't really like the fact that we have to do this sort business for each of these. So let's just say this dot sort right off the bat, and then other array dot sort. So that's going to happen inside the equal. So now it's not checking if they're equal. It's checking if they contain the same elements as the other one. So we could take that, and now we don't have to do this part. We don't have to sort these because it's going to happen naturally up here. So let's run this. And the nice thing about this is that it's very semantic. Your arms contain same elements as friends' arms. If someone was not familiar with this at all, if they hadn't been following, if they didn't see any of this stuff, if it wasn't clear to them what we were trying to do, just reading this statement right here is pretty self-explanatory. This array contains the same elements as this other array. So that's it's nice to look at because it takes out a lot of the guesswork. We don't have to worry about trying to figure out exactly what it's asking. It lays it all out for us, so it's pretty clear. Now, the unfortunate news is that this is probably something we shouldn't ever do. So basically what they say, or what a lot of people tell you, is you don't want to mess with the prototype of an object that you don't own. So an object that you didn't create yourself. Like down here, for example, we've got this arms object, and doing this prototype thing down here, totally fine. Not an issue. We're allowed to do that because we own this object. We created it. The very idea of this object is something we conceived of ourselves. So it's not a problem to mess with its prototype. But the thing is, an array, we probably don't want to change its prototype. And I mean, there are various reasons given for this. A lot of people will say, well, what if you're working on a project and there's a library that altered the array prototype in such a way that it gives us this this new thing called, I don't know, map or something like that. But then another one might alter it in such a way that map is something different, so there could be name collisions. So it can be unsafe to do this kind of stuff. So we're not going to do that. It's nice to know that we can, but we're going to forget about all that. And instead, we're going to go back to what we had down here, which was pretty cool because we're still using prototype, except now we're using it a little more legitimately because it's our own object. We're allowed to do this kind of thing. Okay, so arms.prototype.flex. I mean, the other thing is we could, like, there's this whole idea of inheritance, right? Like we could inherit from array and then say this is a special type of array which has this comparative property, but that's getting a little deep into objects. I mean, we're basically just getting our first intro to object-oriented programming right here, so I don't want to get too deep right now. But the main thing is that we've got our arms object over here. We've got our flex method over here. We're able to get our strongest, our second strongest. I mean, we could even just get our compare function in here. We could say something like arms.prototype.compare, and then just say something like return, and we want to compare it to other arms, right? So we want to basically do this dot strongest is the same as other arms dot strongest, and this dot second strongest is the same as other arms dot second strongest. Okay, so we can use that compare method, and then from there we'll actually do this. So we'll say your arms dot compare to your friend's arms, and we'll see what we get from that in the end. And hopefully that's gonna, there we go, it's gonna pass all the tests. It's going to give us what we're looking for, because that comparison is basically what we were doing before. And we were saying, well, is your strongest arm as strong as your friend's, and is your second strongest arm as strong as your friend's second strongest? Okay, so that's working. That's fine. But something to notice is when we do these flex methods, it's saying, yeah, my strongest is 15. It's not saying anything about the second strongest here. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe that's because like these guys with their arms, they don't want to they want to brag about their strongest lifting capability, but they don't want to reveal what their weakest is, right? So this is where it maybe becomes a bit of a problem because not compare console.log. Maybe the idea is that your friend doesn't necessarily want to reveal this, but your friend's weakest is something like that, and we'll put a plus to concatenate that onto the end, maybe even a semicolon, why not? So we'll run this, and basically what we're going to find is now it's saying, yeah, my strongest is 15, my friend's weakest is 10. It's kind of revealing this other information, and maybe we don't want to reveal that, maybe we don't want to say what that is. So there are ways we can do that. I mean, we can build in other methods. We can build in accessors and mutators, also known as getters and setters. But now we're sort of getting into conventions that are really popular in like OOP languages. Like the little bit of Java that I've done involved a lot of object-oriented programming, and we saw things a little differently. We saw that they had syntax there that made a little more sense for this kind of thing. So this has now been added to ES6. So in ES6, we can do this thing that's like class. And so we can say class arms. And then from there, we don't have to worry about using the same syntax as before. We can use this kind of newer, more self-descriptive syntax where within the class of arms, we can say something like constructor. And constructor, I mean, that's what we've got over here. Like this is the constructor that we're using. So we could even just grab this and say that's going to be our constructor. Boom. Okay, that's it for our constructor. And then we could say something like what else? Well, we could put in another method here. We could put in flex, right? And that's something that didn't take any arguments. So for flex, it's just going to be this thing right here. And then we'll say compare, right? There's another one, compare other arms. And so for compare, we'll just put this in as our function. And there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to get rid of all this stuff. And we'll see, does this still work? So I'm going to try to run this. And basically, what we have here is the constructor is telling us what properties the object has. So it's going to have this dot strongest and this dot second strongest. We can see that it's still working. Our methods are being defined down here. So flex, compare, we're just defining them all within our big class over here. So this kind of syntax is a little closer to what we're used to seeing in other languages. The problem is that I haven't yet solved this issue, right? We're still able to just grab that weakest value, and like I was saying, we maybe don't want to do that. So we're going to remix this a little bit. Instead of saying that it has a property named strongest and a property named second strongest, instead we're going to let strongest be assigned the value of that, and let second strongest be assigned the value of that. Now they exist within the scope of this constructor, so they're not properties. We wouldn't have a this dot strongest or this dot second strongest anymore. In fact, if I were to run this, I would have a whole slew of errors because of that. See all these undefineds everywhere? Like it's trying to flex, but then it's saying, well, I don't know what this dot strongest is. It's trying to compare, and it doesn't know what this dot strongest is, doesn't know what other arm dot strongest is. We're getting a true here, but I think that's true in the sense that it's basically telling us like undefined equals undefined. Anyway, the point is, okay, so now these functions need to be able to access these properties, right? So instead, the way we're going to do it is we're going to say this dot flex, for example, is going to be assigned the value of a function which basically does this over here, except still it doesn't know what this dot strongest is, so instead we're just going to say strongest, because strongest is something that exists within the scope of this constructor here. Okay, So that's what flex is doing now. And then we could also say this dot compare is assign the value of function other arms, and it's just going to do what the compare function did before. So it's just going to return this stuff, and there we go. So we can get rid of these now, and we're kind of defining them a little closer to what we were doing before. We're basically using them as properties, but properties that happen to be functions. Okay, so now if we run this stuff, is it still going to work? Well, yeah, it still works. Well, to some extent anyway. We got the wrong answer here. We'll look into why that was in just a sec. But notice this. It's saying my strongest is 15. So it's still able to access these strongest values. And maybe we'll go to one where they're not the same. Yeah, so, right, it's able to access these different instances. So strongest, when it was doing the constructor for your arms, strongest was 15. When it was doing the constructor for friend's arms, strongest was 20. So it's remembering these things, you know, like strongest and second strongest, even though they only exist within the scope of constructor, they're being remembered by flex because flex is making a reference to them. So that might remind you of what we saw in task 14, this idea of closures, the idea that yeah, strongest is something that only exists within the scope of constructor, but this function was defined within constructor and therefore it maintains access to that scope. And the same should be true of compare. The problem is we still have these this and other arms dot and that kind of thing. So we don't want that. We want second strongest. But here's the issue. You know, we can't get this. Like we still need other arms in here to be able to make this comparison. So that's the only way this is really going to work is if we do have some way of accessing strongest. So I don't know. What's the best way to do this? That's a tough question. As you guys may know, OOP is not my strength. It's not necessarily the paradigm I tend to use most of the time, but I wanted you to be aware of it. I want you to have an understanding of sort of what objects are, how we can declare them, instantiate them, how we can construct them, all that kind of stuff. Now, one thing I do want to mention is I was looking at this Medium article, and what is this one? So it's by Eric Elliott. It's called The Two Pillars of JavaScript. And there's this one part down here where it says this: the class keyword is now the most harmful feature in JavaScript. So that's pretty strongly worded. I mean, I think that's kind of implying that maybe we shouldn't do this. You know, maybe we shouldn't use this this class business here. And we're not going to get into the reasons why, or at least we're not going to get deep into the reasons why right now. I really just wanted to give sort of an intro. Whoops. Just wanted to give a bit of an intro in terms of how this OOP business is working. And let's see. I can't seem to undo anymore, so let's see if this was a stable version. Yeah, okay, this was stable, so maybe we'll just go with this and we'll say that's probably good enough for now. That's given us a bit of an intro to this object-oriented programming business. It does seem to be solving the problem. Let's just see if it's solving all the hidden tests as well. And yeah, it is. Okay, so that's a way we can do it. Is it the best way? Well, okay, for this particular problem, no, it's not the best way. It's super overkill. I mean, this is way, way more stuff than we need to be able to solve this. We found we were able to solve this by just doing like this equals this and this equals this, or this equals this and this equals this. I mean, it was very, very simple. One line. Doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. Okay, so I think that's where we're going to wrap it up for this one. If anyone has any questions, let me know. But for now, that's our equally strong. All right, so